Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bay Area Council's weekly Impact webinar. Today's subject matter is Brexit. More specifically, what does Brexit mean for the UK and its closest neighbour, Ireland? And what does it mean to the many US and Bay Area companies who have substantial presences in both countries and across the European Union? My name is Matt Regan. I'm Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Bay Area Council, so welcome and thank you for joining us. Little housekeeping issue, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please enter them there. They will be moderated and we will try and get to them as best we can. I'm going to start with a quick 2-minute Cliff Note history of Brexit for those for the uninitiated. On June 23rd, 2016, the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union by a slim 51% margin. It should be noted that the voters of Northern Ireland and Scotland both voted to remain by large majorities. So the desire to leave the EU is an English-driven phenomenon. The UK had belonged to the European Union and its predecessor institutions since 1973. So the vote was quite a shock to many observers. The following year, Theresa May's Conservative government triggered Article 50 of the European Union Constitution and formally began the decoupling process from Europe, the first full member state to ever do so. One very important detail that Theresa May's government grappled unsuccessfully with is the fact that the UK shares a land border with the EU that would obviously require customs and immigration controls post-Brexit like any other international border. That border is a little different, however, than most borders and has been subject to many disputes since its creation in 1921. I am, of course, talking about the border between the 6-county Northern Ireland state, which is part of the UK, and the 26-county Republic of Ireland, which remains, of course, a part of the European Union. That border, and most importantly, what can be placed on that border, is subject to an international peace agreement signed by both the UK and Ireland. The Good Friday or Belfast Agreement of 1997 brought about the end of 30 years of bloodshed in Northern Ireland. And it stipulates that that border should remain open, be subject to no return to any hardening, i.e. the construction of border controls, customs, immigration, military facilities, etc. So Mrs. May was not able to square this circle and find a withdrawal agreement that she could pass through Parliament. So she stepped aside. Boris Johnson was, of course, elected leader of the Conservative Party and by default Prime Minister. He did square the circle and was able to negotiate a withdrawal agreement through the British Parliament, which effectively allowed Northern Ireland to remain within the European Union single market and effectively create a border down the Irish Sea for trade purposes. That withdrawal agreement was ratified by the British Parliament and subsequently by the European Union and was set to go into effect on January 2021 when the UK officially leaves the European Union. A spanner was thrown into the works by Mr. Johnson's government when they announced that they would no longer abide by the Northern Ireland protocols in the withdrawal agreement, and that they would break the agreement in, quote, very limited ways. In other words, a hard border is back on the table. Just yesterday, the EU served notice that they would challenge this violation in court if necessary. So what does all of this mean for trade and the economies of Ireland, North and South, the UK and the EU? What would an ugly divorce from the EU mean with no trade deal? Where does the US stand, and what steps will they take to defend the Good Friday Agreement that is being this country was a principal driver in its creation. So to discuss these issues, we're very fortunate to have the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, His Excellency Daniel Mulhall. Ambassador Mulhall is Ireland's most senior diplomat, and you don't get this job straight out of diplomat school. And he's served in similar roles in India, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and of course the European Union. He's an accomplished writer and historian, a poet, and if you're not following him on Twitter, you should. Also on the panel, we have Conall McDevitt. Conall is the CEO of Hume Brophy, a Dublin-based international consultancy firm that advises clients on a wide range of issues, including Brexit. Conall is a former member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, representing South Belfast. Like myself, he's an aging runner. You should probably follow him on Twitter too. And to moderate our conversation, we're very lucky to have the Bay Area Council's own international trade expert, Dr. Sean Randolph. Sean is our ageless runner, and he will be, Sean has decades of, I won't say how many, of experience working in international trade. So Sean, I'm going to pass it over to you. Take it away and enjoy the conversation, everyone.
Well, thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for setting the table for this morning's conversation. And welcome to you, Ambassador Mulhall, and welcome to you, Connell. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. And as we do, I want to remind our audience again that if you have questions, please just submit them through the chat function at the bottom of the page, and we'll get to as many as we can in the next hour. So we'll start with you, Ambassador Mulhall. Welcome again to today's forum. And can you give us an update from your perspective on the status of the negotiations on the trade agreement between the EU and the UK? The December 31st exit is set. It's going to happen under the Withdrawal Agreement. But what's on the table is the trade agreement and a hard Brexit, or a not hard breakfast, my word, not hard Brexit. And so, as Matt mentioned, there are some issues that have come up in the last short period that have raised some questions about where that process is going. And we'd love to hear your perspective on what may happen between now and the end of the year.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you to Sean Randolph and to Matt Regan and to our consulate in San Francisco for putting together this event. I'm very happy to talk to the members of the Bay Area Economic Council. Where do we stand? Well, time is not on our side. After years of negotiations, which culminated last year in the Withdrawal Agreement being signed by both parties, including, of course, a protocol on Northern Ireland. That looked to have set us up for a pretty good 2020, but of course 2020 has not been exactly what people thought it might be in a whole range of areas, shall we say, and Brexit is no different, because the negotiations have become stalled, and then we're not going well. I'm talking now about the overall negotiation between the EU and the UK. There's a lot of grandstanding, a lot of exchanges of statements which were quite which ratcheted up the the stakes in the negotiations. However, in the last few weeks, I think we can detect a certain improvement in the urgency that surrounds those negotiations now, because we're running out of time. We have maximum a month left before the clock runs out, because the European Parliament has said it would need to see the agreement by the end of October if it's to be able to ratify it by the end of the year. Now, there might be a little bit of leeway there, I don't know, but in any case, what we have now left to us after 4.5 years since the referendum, which decided that Britain would leave the European Union, we have now 6 weeks left, maximum 6 weeks. And there are big issues to be dealt with. The principal one, I would say, is the what the European Union calls the level playing field, although you could call it other names, of course, and probably will end up being called something else, because that wording seems to be allergic from a British point of view. So what we're talking about here is avoiding Britain having the capacity, while having full access, tariff-free access, and quota-free access to the European single market, being able to introduce state aids that would give their companies an unfair advantage in the European single market. And that is obviously not acceptable, not so much to Ireland, although it's difficult for us too, but to the countries across the European Union, because it would put their companies at a very significant disadvantage, in that they would be competing in the European single market with companies from Britain that would be in receipt of state aid. And then the other issue, which is a tricky one still, is the question of fisheries, which is economically not particularly important, but I know from Ireland that it's one of these things that does pull at the heartstrings, and it has a certain kind of resonance with the public, who tend to believe that the fish in our water should belong to us rather than be shared with other countries, as we have at the moment within the European Union. The problem, of course, is that fish move, and therefore it's not that easy to pin them down. They don't recognize borders in the sea or anywhere else for that matter. So now those two issues, I believe, are capable of being resolved. But the spanner that was thrown into the works a couple of weeks back with this withdrawal agreement, with this Internal Market Act, which the British government proposed and has now been passed by the House of Commons. It's currently in the House of Lords, but it'll probably be amended and it will come back to the House of Commons for final approval in the period ahead at some point. And that is a threat to the good name of the United Kingdom, because it's basically nakedly saying that if it doesn't suit us, we will break international law and we will override the agreement we made only last year, made by the same government, by the same Prime Minister, and approved by Parliament in both the UK and the European Union. And that has really caused a very severe reaction on the part of the European Union and its member states. And now, I think if we set that aside, which I think we should do, and concentrate on resolving the issues at stake, if those issues were to be resolved, the issues that arise in the Internal Market Act would probably largely become redundant. And I dare say that would be, I dare say that something would be done to the legislation to make it clear that those issues were redundant or would be redundant. So we're in a complicated situation at the moment. The negotiations are beginning to pick up pace, but this move by the British government has caused a lack of trust. It's caused the tensions between the two sides to be ratcheted up. It's also created more than a few ripples in Northern Ireland, where, of course, people tend to take different sides of most issues, and this is no exception. And while a month ago we probably had assumed that people in Northern Ireland on both sides of the divide had more or less come to terms with the fact there would be a protocol and it would involve some kind of limited checks on goods crossing the Irish Sea. But now, of course, with the British government's move, this has thrown that whole issue of the protocol back into the melting pot again, and you have now parties taking positions, opposite positions about whether or not this Internal Market Act is a good idea or not. And so we had the two unionist parties are in favour of the Act broadly, and the four other parties, the Sinn Féin, the FCLP, the Alliance Party, and the Green Party, have issued a statement opposing the use of this Act and urging the government to adhere to the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that's where we stand at the moment. It's an uncertain situation. There's a lot of fluidity, and there's a lot of opposition in Britain to what the British government are trying to do. There's a lot of people in the House of Lords who are dead set against it. 5 prime ministers now have expressed themselves opposed to this Internal Market Act. And in the European Union, it's causing a lot of difficulties in the negotiations. And in Northern Ireland, it's stirred things up in a helpful way. It's never a good idea to use Northern Ireland as a political ploy to gain advantage in a negotiation, because there are too many other issues that arise in Northern Ireland, and you don't want to upset an already fragile situation. That is always the case in Northern Ireland. But unfortunately, this move has done just that, because it's polarized people in both communities yet again on another issue when we could do with trying to reduce polarization. Thank you.
Well, thanks for walking us into this topic so deeply. We'll come to you now, Connell. Tell us a little bit about your firm and how you come to this conversation, and what's your outlook for what may happen between now and the end of the year.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you to the Bay Area Council for inviting us to participate. And first of all, greetings from Belfast, which, if you know your Irish geography, is the 2nd city on the island of Ireland by population and size. And tragically now, the first city on the island of Ireland outside of the European Union, because Brexit, unfortunately, has happened. What we are in at the moment is a transition period. Brexit happened at the beginning of the year, at the end of January, and this whole situation that is unfolding now is a transition period that allowed for negotiations, which Ambassador Mulhall has summarised very well. I'm the Chief Executive of Hume Brophy. We are an international public affairs, or as people in the United States would probably know better, government relations and corporate communications firm. We have teams, rather large teams, in London, Dublin, Brussels, Frankfurt, Paris, small team in New York, and a significant presence in Hong Kong and Singapore. And we specialize in highly regulated international industries. And so the technology sector would be a significant sector within our business. And we would do a lot of technology work at EU level, out of Brussels, out of Dublin, given Dublin's importance as a technology hub within the European Union, and also in London. And so the perspective I think I can bring to today's conversation is one of considering and trying to sort of reflect on the implications for the technology sector and possibly the Bay Area Council's members of the different scenarios which Ambassador Mulhall sort of outlined, and they are essentially fundamentally two. We either get some sort of agreement in the coming weeks, literally, which paves the way for, I would suspect, a framework which allows Northern Ireland to participate in a kind of special way within the European market at the same time, obviously, as remaining part of the United Kingdom and therefore outside of the European Union, allows the United Kingdom to properly exit the European Union and ply its wares on the international stage as an independent third country. And that's your good outcome. Your bad outcome is that whether by design or by accident, we end up in a no deal scenario. And if that were to happen, and obviously I don't really know of anyone anywhere on this continent who I think would like to see that happen, then we are into exceptionally difficult and uncharted territories. And those territories include significant risks for every sector of our economy, not least the technology sector. And may I just conclude sort of my response to your introductory question there, Sean, by saying that as someone who spent my entire adult life in this part of Ireland and has had the privilege to represent some of its people in the assembly that was the product of the Good Friday Agreement, and the great honor of working with Ambassador Mulhall, when I was the SDLP's press officer and he was the press officer for the Department of Foreign Affairs during the talks. He's a very good press officer, exceptional ambassador, but an exceptionally good press officer. I have a slight vested interest in making sure that the great work of our generation, which has been to change the course of history on this island and on these islands, is not affected by Brexit. It will be affected by the consequences of Brexit, but I am very determined that we do not lose the exceptional momentum that has been built up in this northern part of our island in particular. I have a 20-year-old son in second year in university in this city of Belfast. The Ireland and the Northern Ireland he is part of was only imaginable by our poets 40 years ago. It was imaginable by the likes of Seamus Heaney and people like that, but it was not imaginable by politicians, with the exception of possibly John Hume, who had a vision for a reconciled, peaceful, agreed place where people could work the common ground. And so whatever happens in the coming weeks, it is essential that Northern Ireland, as Ambassador Mulhall said, does not become a pawn on a wider negotiating chessboard. Northern Ireland must be taken right off that board, and neither a British government, nor a European Union, nor an American government, nor obviously an Irish government can or will ever, should ever be allowed to politicize it or to sort of, using a word that's often used in negotiations, to weaponize it in the context of a negotiation. And, it's a difficult time. There's a pandemic. It is occupying regional governments. It is bringing governments together, a power sharing government in this part of the world, which is at its best when it works the common ground. And, fighting a pandemic, may not be the common ground they would have chosen for, but it brings them together. And a unionist Minister for Health and a, Republican First Minister and a very, very conservative unionist, Republican Deputy First Minister and very conservative unionist First Minister are working that common ground at the moment. Brexit can't be allowed to get in the middle of that. And it's in nobody's interest, not in mine and the 900,000 people in this part of Ireland, the 8 million people on the island. It's not in the interests of the members of the Bay Council, Area Council either. It's in nobody's interest that we slip up over the next 6 weeks.
Well, thanks very much, Connell, especially that perspective from Ireland. Ambassador Mulhall, it appears, and this goes back deep in the last 4 years of negotiations, that the EU doesn't have much or any appetite for more concessions to the UK, and it appears that the UK government is prepared to leave the EU without a trade agreement, with a hard exit. Is this issue of the Northern Ireland border and customs arrangement a make it or break it issue for the EU and Ireland? It is. I'm guessing there's no middle ground, but is there? And I think also I'm told you have personal experience. You know Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
I do.
What do you think is driving the government's policy in London? Is it sort of deep policy issues, or to what degree would it be a negotiating tactic? So how do you see this playing within the UK government?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to know. I mean, I was in London, of course, as ambassador all through the run up to the referendum in 2016, and then I was there for a year after the referendum. So I saw the fallout from it, and I observed that at close quarters, and I talked to people about it intensively and so on. So my conclusion is that there is, I would say, almost no economic rationale for Brexit. Now, some people argue that, well, in 10 years' time, everything will settle down and the effects won't be that great. In fact, the UK may do quite well as a global trading nation and so on. Fine, but 10 years' time, 10 years is a long time to be waiting for a reward from a particular move that's been made to leave the European Union. I mean, the bottom line is that the UK will be leaving a union, the most advanced single market in the world, which accounts for 45% of UK exports. So can you imagine California deciding, I'm not recommending this, by the way, because I know it didn't go well the last time it happened, but imagine if California decided, we can't be bothered with these other American countries, and we're going to, California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and it could no doubt do it, but you'd be creating problems for yourselves with the vast bulk of your trade with the other states of the United States. And you'd be hoping to compensate for that by getting more trade with faraway countries. I always say to people here, ask the question, rhetorical, who are the United States' 2 biggest export markets? Which countries? We all know the answer. It's Mexico and Canada, right? They are not the 2 biggest countries in the world by any means. Mexico is a middle-income country with 150 million people. Canada is an advanced country with 35 million people. So why are they the most important markets for the US? Because they're nearby. And this idea that some people have in Britain, that you can compensate with trade deals with Australia and Japan and the United States for losing markets that are very close by across the channel that account for 45% of your exports. Remember that Ireland, with 5 million people, is the 5th biggest market for UK exports. And that just shows you the power of proximity. That just shows you the risks that are being taken. So for me, the Brexit project was always a political project. It was driven by people who have a view of sovereignty that causes them to conclude that even a scintilla of authority leaving the UK, any sort of modicum of control leaving the UK and being decided by European institutions, the European Parliament, the European courts, is anathema to them. Now, of course, that is in many ways not a very sensible position, because we're members, and so is the UK, members of all sorts of international organizations where you agree to obey the rules of those organizations. But anyway, the sovereignty thing became a real bone of contention for people in the UK, those who drove the Brexit agenda. So I still have the view that ultimately the fear of entering into a world where you cut yourself off overnight, all of a sudden, from nearly half of your export markets will determine that somehow a negotiation will be concluded in the next 4 weeks, and that we will probably late one night in Brussels, 3 or 4 in the morning, there'll be all the members of the Council, the European Council, the Prime Ministers, and Boris Johnson on the UK side will come out of that council bleary-eyed and will declare that they have reached an agreement. Now, that ought to be certain. That ought to be 100% certain that that would happen. The fact that it's not certain is an alarming prospect because it could still go wrong. But our minister, who was here during the week, said that he believes, he's optimistic. Well, he's cautiously optimistic, hopeful that an agreement can still be reached, because he believes that agreement can be reached, and that there is a compromise that can be struck, and that it ought to be struck, and that he's hopeful that it will be struck. But he also says that you can't be sure, because there are political forces at work here which seem determined to avoid the economic logic of the situation that confronts the UK as it plans to leave the European Union.
Thanks. We have a follow-up question from the audience, noting that the most senior congressional leadership in Washington, including Speaker Pelosi, have expressed their concern about this latest development and have suggested that a US-UK agreement would not happen if this bill were to go through. I would imagine, given the government and the UK's stake in having that US FTA follow the departure from the EU, that would be a priority. So are you perceiving any impact in London from what they're hearing from the congressional leadership here?
This point was first made about a year ago, when Speaker Pelosi led a delegation of the Ways and Means Committee to Ireland, North and South, and to London. And during that visit, the Speaker made a statement both in London and repeated it in Dublin and in Belfast, that should there be a version of Brexit that undermines the existence of an open border on the island of Ireland, and that therefore damages the peace process of the Good Friday Agreement, that the US Congress would not allow a UK-US trade agreement to pass through the House. So that was a very strong statement. And I have a suspicion that that statement was very powerful when it came to the calculations being made in London about, because the trade agreement with the US is seen by many people on the Brexit side of the argument as the key ingredient in countering the losses sustained from leaving the single market, and countering those with the opportunities available from a free trade agreement with the United States. So I've no doubt but that factor weighed heavily with the British as they were calculating their options last year. And the Speaker has reiterated those points yesterday and indeed last week. She said, the same thing to our visiting minister, and so has the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Richard Neal of Massachusetts, who is a strong supporter of the Good Friday Agreement and the Irish peace process. So there's still a roadblock in the way of a UK-US agreement should Brexit result in disruption to the Good Friday Agreement and the open border on the island of Ireland. I think that's an important factor, which I think will also this year weigh with the British government and those who are in charge of negotiations with the EU.
Thanks. Conal, turning to you, two scenarios: successful trade agreement, soft exit; no trade agreement, hard exit. What do you think are the consequences for US and Bay Area California companies that have extensive operations in the UK, which many do, in Ireland, which many do, and in Europe, which many do? So we sort of have a binary set of options here. What do you think the implications are in either direction?
I think to look at the optimistic scenario first, if there is an agreement, even if it's a thin agreement, which I think is probably where we will land, and I'm encouraged to hear the optimism of Minister Coveney. That's what I would pick up as well. Then I think what will have to be included, and what I would be looking to have included if I were in the tech space, certainly in the multinational tech space in Europe with operations in Ireland and the United Kingdom, I need to see some certainty around movement of talent and people. Technology and innovation in the European Union relies on talent. That talent is very mobile within the European Union or within the European continent. And so the United Kingdom, if it's to retain its technology capacity. It needs to be able to access that talent, and therefore there can't be any barriers on the movement of people. The second thing that I think you would obviously be very concerned about would be data, or data, depending on how you pronounce it. Data flows freely across Europe and is regulated at the personal level through a famous piece of regulation called the GDPR, which I'm sure will be familiar to many on the call. And you know, during this transition period, the transmission of data in and out of the United Kingdom to other parts of the European Union is enabled. However, if you read the withdrawal agreement, you'll see that Article 7 is crystal clear. If there is no agreement, then the United Kingdom will lose access to all European databases from the end of this year, period. The only data that people would have access to would be legacy data, and the United Kingdom would be obliged to maintain that data to the standard at which the European Union requires it to be maintained currently for it to be able to be accessed. And so there needs to be what's known as an adequacy agreement built into this next 5 weeks discussions. That adequacy agreement needs to allow data to continue to move from the United Kingdom to the rest of the European Union and vice versa. And I suppose the final bit I would be thinking about and you know, reflecting on our own clients in this space, they would be thinking about is the wider goods and services piece. Obviously, services and technology industry, you know, all over the world is supporting the service industry in itself. A huge play in the financial services sector. Obviously, financial technology, fintech is exceptionally important to the United States, and it's increasingly important to the United Kingdom. The City of London and the passporting rights and licensing rights for the you know, the flow of capital and financial transactions needs to be addressed in whatever agreement is reached. Should it be achieved? And if any of those things are missing, you have a big problem. You have a very, very major problem. If there is no deal, it's really, Sean, it's a really bad scenario. I mean, it's, you know, it's quite unimaginable, really. You know, you would have immediate shutting down of the data wall. They'd have to patch together, I would think, some sort of wafer thin sort of operating agreement, which I'm sure would be the subject of litigation and challenge. Capital markets flow would be exceptionally undermined and would be very dangerous. Movement of people would become a huge issue, massive issue. Movement of talent would become a massive issue. And, you know, I think as Ambassador Mulhall has said, you know, Brexit is nearly, you know, in the no deal Brexit is just a guaranteed lose-lose scenario. And there aren't too many rational people, whether they're politicians, business people, or diplomats, who are in favor of negotiating lose-lose outcomes. And so, you know, the prospects of a hard Brexit are really quite exceptionally bad for the United Kingdom and for Europe and for Ireland.
Thanks, Conal. Well, you know, as you mentioned, it's especially important, or these issues are especially important for our companies here in the Bay Area. We have so many companies that are heavily invested in both the UK and in Ireland. Especially in London, lots in financial services, sort of a bridge into the rest of Europe. And in the UK and Ireland, so many of our large tech companies have a large footprint, and they're moving data globally. So I think through those two windows in particular, there are really large implications for our companies and their future investment and their ability to operate in the larger European setting. So a major interest here. Ambassador Mulhall, I can maybe follow up again, and this could be for you as well, Conal. We have a cluster of questions here. They fit into one sort of a pattern. One is that maybe one of our questioners heard it wrong, Ambassador Mulhall, but you seem to perhaps in one of your earlier comments raise some opening or doubt about the actual Brexit deadline or the deadline of the trade agreement. Was that really within the period up until December 31, or do you see any flexibility time-wise after that? There's another question about whether there's any prospect at all for a a re-entry of the UK into the EU. Kind of doubt it, but that's part of this cluster of questions. And the other, I guess we're getting in some sensitive ground here, but we're not shy about that. There's a question suggesting that there are a lot of people in the UK who would just rather not deal with Northern Ireland. And if things go their own way, that's okay. So how would you address those sort of interrelated topics?
Okay, well, look, I think that what we have to understand is that the Good Friday Agreement was the game changer in Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and in the United Kingdom, because here you have a part of the UK which is governed by a separate regime. Scotland, of course, has devolution. Wales has devolution, but neither of those places has the Good Friday Agreement, which is a comprehensive agreement that, number one, requires a coalition to be formed between the Unionist parties and the Nationalist parties. That is not the case in Scotland. It's not the case in Wales. So I think what a lot of people in Britain fail to grasp at the beginning, and even now, is that the Good Friday Agreement has implications. And those implications were always going to create difficulties when it came to Brexit, because you were removing a place from the European Union that is not like Lancashire or Yorkshire or Middlesex. It's a place that has an international regime, an international treaty, which governs the way that place operates. And flowing on from that, you had an agreement. You've had what we've had now 20 plus years of development. And Northern Ireland is a very different place now, as Conall has already said, from what it was like. I mean, I remember my first time going to Northern Ireland. It was pretty strange place, and now it's a pretty normal place, I would say. And everyone in Northern Ireland and on the island of Ireland and everyone across the board wants it to stay that way. But the trouble is that political decisions, have consequences, and this decision on the part of the British government has really thrown the whole negotiating process into a certain amount of disarray, that we don't know whether this is a fundamental principle of the British government, break international law. We don't know whether it might be a negotiating tactic. We don't know what they're willing to do in the next few weeks to get agreement between the EU and the UK on a trade agreement. And by the way, we in Ireland desperately want to see the UK achieve a trade agreement with the EU and with the US, because that's the best thing for us. That's the best option for us. Because we want to see the UK thrive and prosper. We don't want to see the UK damaged economically, because that'll damage us too, because of our close relations with them. So as far as re-entry into the EU is concerned, I think it's probably for another generation. I just don't see anyone wanting to go down this road again anytime soon. But I dare say, with a new generation coming on stream, seeing how the European Union, assuming as I do, that the Union will continue to develop in a positive way and will produce positive outcomes for the people of Europe, there may be a new generation rising up in a decade's time or so that may want to revisit this issue. As far as people in Britain not caring about Northern Ireland is concerned, well, I mean, I'm sure there are people like that, but I didn't really come across them when I was ambassador in London. What I did come across were people who thought that everything in Northern Ireland was hunky-dory. Didn't we have that thing that happened 20 years ago, the Good Friday Agreement? And didn't that solve everything? So there was a certain amount of complacency on the one hand, and also not fully appreciating or understanding that Northern Ireland is a place that needs continuing work to move it forward towards what we want to see in Northern Ireland, which is a place which is not only peaceful, but also reconciled, that the two communities are in a reconciliation environment, rather than one that can lead to conflict anytime they fall out over any issue. So I don't think that Britain is going to behave irresponsibly, visibly in Northern Ireland. But I do think that, unfortunately, what's been done in the last couple of weeks, it's not intentional. I hope. I don't believe it is intentional, but the inadvertent consequence of it could be very damaging for Britain's relations with the European Union, for relations on the island of Ireland, and indeed for the situation in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Conal, a question for you. This is one from the audience. With a trade agreement, or let's say with a hard Brexit, do you foresee any significant shifting of people, say talent, in and out of the UK to Ireland or other parts of Europe, and of company business activity, either in whole or in part, in either scenario? So I actually have family living in the UK, and this is a factor. They're not going anywhere at the moment, but it's a topic. We know our companies want to do business in the mainland of Europe, but it may be harder from the UK. So, talent is a big factor for their economy, as it is for ours. And business location is, of course, a huge issue, with so many of our Bay Area companies invested in the UK, Ireland, and across Europe. So what kind of movement and to what extent would you see these kinds of changes, if there is an agreement, or if there isn't?
Well, there already has been a degree of movement, John, I suppose, is the evidence-based answer to that question. I mean, we in Hume Brophy advised Barclays on their move from the City of London to Dublin. And we also advised Citadel Capital Markets Company for its move from the City of London to Dublin as well. And those are just two very practical examples of global leaders in the financial services space, on the banking and on the capital market side, who have already taken decisions, and others have done likewise, as you know. Another interesting anecdote, which will illustrate kind of the nervousness, I think, amongst talent, the professional class in the United Kingdom, has been the increase in British people who have sought to take advantage of their European citizen rights. So there has been a very significant uptick in applications for Irish passports by British citizens. And these are people who would have a right, a legitimate, absolute right to Irish citizenship, because they may have a grandparent or a parent or whatever who was Irish. And there's been a massive increase in that. There's been a similar increase, very interestingly, for the historians on the call, for applications for German passports. And those people would have been and are oftentimes the families or the descendants of refugees from the Second World War, often Jewish refugees. But they are taking advantage now of the opportunity to exercise the right because of their determination to remain European citizens, irrespective of what happens. So that's happening already, Sean. I think that's important to understand. And therefore, Britain's relationship with the world, and British people, many British citizens' relationship with their own state and with the world, is already in a flux. It's already shifting. And we won't know the consequences of that shift probably for a decade or so. If there were to be a no deal in the next, 6 to 8 weeks, then I think you're in a very serious international crisis, frankly. I suspect there would be movement to get a deal in place as urgently as possible, and there would be the best skills of the world's finest diplomats on both sides of that table to paper over the issue and to try and avoid it, because there is very, 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 very few people in the United Kingdom who want and can conceive of any advantage from a no deal scenario. Brexit is, in my humble opinion, the project of a particular political ideology within England, an English nationalist ideology that has been present within the Conservative Party for many decades, and which ended up ascendant for whatever reason. And it has hijacked an entire nation state against the wills of the people of Scotland, against the will of the people of Northern Ireland. You could argue against the will of the people of Wales, even though they voted by a slim majority to leave. Brexit, I do not think represents modern Britain. I think it is just something that is happening to modern Britain. And so therefore, if there were a no deal scenario, you're in a really quite serious situation, because you essentially have, a very small political ideology, which is not very thought through, which does not have a sophisticated vision of Britain outside the European Union, except that it has to be outside the European Union, becoming, a bit like has happened in other parts of the world, maybe not too far from where you guys are right now, becoming in charge. And I don't think that's a scenario that even Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Dominic Raab and those who have the great privilege of holding the highest offices of state in the United Kingdom today will let happen. It may happen by accident, but I don't think it's in their interests or in their interests of their state or of their party for them to consciously allow it to happen. But these next weeks, I mean, you're dealing with a very, very, very significant moment in history, which historians will pore over for decades to come. And the decisions that are taken, the calls that are made, will have impacts on us all for generations. And, as the ambassador has said, it is difficult to understand why they would have brought that bill to the floor of the House of Commons. It's difficult to rationalize why you would just ratchet things so far. A colleague of ex-colleague of Ambassador Mulhall's, Rory Montgomery, who very eminent Irish diplomat, went on to serve in the Department of Taoiseach, said, it felt a bit to him like madman theory at play from the old Nixon days. And maybe that is what is at play, and it's strategic. To me, it feels like an absolute, overplaying of a hand, frankly. And I'm just hope that these weeks now will allow it to pull back, and for the saner heads and the calmer constitutions to find a path to some sort of settlement, albeit a thin one.
Maybe to follow up on maybe one industry, which is important to us here, financial services. Yeah. So the last time I looked, there had not been a diminution of venture investment or startup activity in London, despite everything going on. Now, if there were an outflow of talent, that would be a different question, but it appears so far that most of the talent is staying at the moment, and the money is there. But for larger financial institutions, in the event of a hard exit, do you think that they would be moving entirely out of London, or they would keep headquarters operations for Europe in London and maybe move certain sort of operations that relate specifically to dealing with the continent or other parts of the EU outside of the UK? Like, how would they make those decisions?
Well, from a regulatory point of view, there'd be certain functions they would just have to move out of London. Well, there are certain functions they have to move out of London anyway in order to maintain their passporting and licensing rights and so on and so forth. So there's certain compliance, regulatory, licensing, headquartering. Most member states will not allow brass plating. Most member states will not allow you just to sort of, register yourself in jurisdiction A and not have to bring some investment with you. So that leads to some outflow. You're right. In terms of the City of London and the core talent of very, very exceptionally well-paid, well-skilled individuals who make up the City of London, there's been little sort of fleeing from the city, and that's largely because it's a very attractive place to live. A lot of other member states and large European cities would struggle to be as attractive a place to be as London is, and that's because London has had the head start of 30, 40 years of building up the city into what it is today, and it's got the infrastructure to support these people, their lifestyles, their children, their the private schooling system, all that sort of stuff is part of the offer that makes those sort of people want to be in London, and they'll be reluctant to leave, and they have been very reluctant to leave. Paris had a rough time, Sean, getting asset managers to shift over because it just didn't have the same offer. It doesn't speak English. And English is the common language of the international financial services world. It doesn't have the same infrastructure for sort of an international community. It is not the same type of global city. But if there were a hard Brexit, the rules just all change. And so unless those people want to reconstruct their careers doing financial services work for countries which are not the countries that the City of London currently relies on today, then they'll probably have to start thinking about a career outside of the city. And again, this is why, you know, events of the past couple of weeks are so difficult to kind of comprehend, because if you were the British state, why would you even risk that? I mean, the City of London is, I can't remember, I think it's 24% of British GDP. You know, just the city, just the square mile. Why would you risk that by gaming out a sort of a high political, you know, act with no safety valve? But you are absolutely right. You know, I mean, if the next 6 weeks go badly wrong, the City of London and the financial services community in the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom's place in the world as a financial services centre will be, if not fundamentally challenged, it will be fundamentally changed. And the change, and this is where, you know, companies like ourselves who rely on the city, who have a good business in the city, the change would be that we would go from managing and advising on the management of a certain type of capital, from a certain type of state, which has a certain set of values and which plays to a certain, set of international rules, to not. And that's a very different place to work. And I mean, I run teams in Hong Kong, I run teams in Singapore, and I can see how and in New York, and I can see international markets and operate in different cultural contexts. And I don't know if the city would be the same place if that were to happen to it. I don't think anyone would want it to be that place. And it certainly would not be in Europe's interest for it to become that place either.
Yeah, thanks, Connell. For either one of you, but maybe Ambassador Mulhall, we have a question about the actual border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. What does it look like physically today in terms of activity and infrastructure? And if there is an agreement, does that just remain the same? Or if there isn't an agreement, how does the border actually look and operate differently?
Okay, well, the border, of course, during the Troubles was a heavily fortified border in the main road crossings from north to south. And I remember going through those crossings as a, back in the 1980s, 90s. And, you know, it was a slightly frightening experience to drive through a sort of chicane, which had watchtowers and, you know, presence of armed soldiers and so on. Today, it's practically, the border doesn't exist. All of those installations have either been removed or else they're now redundant, and you don't even know what they are. They're just buildings that are not serving any purpose. So there's 310 miles, I think it is, of border, but it's not in a straight line. And it doesn't have a river like the Rhine, for example, going between France and Germany. There's no river that separates north from south. There's no range of mountains you have to travel over. There's no big bay you have to go across. So it is literally a case of people in Northern Ireland may cross into the Republic because the nearest shop is in a different jurisdiction. So you can imagine, and of course, a lot of people as well, a lot of people from Donegal are employed in Derry, and they travel across that border every day because Derry is a big city for the hinterland of Derry, for the county of Donegal in particular. And then there are some big US companies in Donegal that rely on skilled staff that are living in Derry and going to Letterkenny, for example, where I think Primerica has a big operation. So there's a lot of movement to and fro across the border, and nobody wants to see that affected. And for example, you know, there are places on the border where people may cross the border a dozen times a day to visit family, to go to the post office, to, you know, collect whatever, to see family, to visit friends, you know. So there's a lot of traffic across that border, and a lot of the border actually, you know, could never really be subjected to proper controls, because even during the Troubles, a lot of the roads were not properly controlled because there's so many of them that go across back and forth. So nobody wants to see that happening because you see, the Good Friday Agreement was a game changer, as I said. And that led on to political agreements, agreements on policing, and all of those things. And in fact, very quickly, within a couple of years, within a year or so of the Good Friday Agreement, the border controls, the border posts were started to be dismantled. So there's been a long, people have been enjoying now 20 plus years of an open border. If you try to change that and impose any sort of controls on those borders, that will create a lot of grief for everyone concerned. And that's why we have been so insistent all around that there can never be a physical border on the island of Ireland, because the open border is part of the follow-on from the Good Friday Agreement, which has made life in Northern Ireland and on the border normal in ways that it could never be during the Troubles and before the agreement. So we want to preserve those precious advantages. We want to avoid turning the clock backwards.
We're almost out of time, but one more question, perhaps for you, Ambassador Mulhall. And this isn't about the Brexit per se, or what will happen in the next 3 months, but in the councils of the EU, where you've spent a lot of time when you were in Brussels, historically, there had been an alignment of sorts between the United States and Britain, where there was a certain like-minded perspective on issues of regulation and free markets, which was not identical to many European continental views. And the UK was, I think, in many respects, or often not a proxy, but a good spokesman for US perspectives and interests within the EU. Now, one way or the other, that's not going to happen anymore. How do you see the conversation within the EU on regulatory issues changing without the UK presence? And where do you think Ireland would fall in that conversation in the future? Obviously, it's not as big as the UK, but I think from a US perspective, we'd be hopeful to still have friends inside those doors who can really speak to open markets and prudent regulations forcefully.
Well, firstly, the UK was probably Ireland's closest ally within the European Union because of the similarity between our systems, and we shared a lot of positions when it came to European Union development. So we missed the UK from that point of view. We've had to try and form new relationships with our partners, with the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries that have very similar, approaches to us, Netherlands, the Benelux. So there is a sort of some kind of a group of countries, emerging who would be more, shall we say, positively disposed towards a lighter regulation, more open to free trade and so forth. But of course, if you add all those countries together, their population probably doesn't reach the population of the United Kingdom. So to lose a big country like that from the kind of side of the house, which is for smart regulation and focus on free trade and competitiveness, that's a big loss. We, of course, are, I think, effective in arguing the case for the EU not doing things that will create difficulties, even if there's an urge to do it. And one example of that would be the digital services tax, where Ireland was one of the few countries in the beginning that said, no, this is a bad idea because this is going to hit US companies specifically, and it's going to create a backlash, and it will be regarded by the United States as a trade barrier, and there'll be retaliation, and this will damage the economies of both the EU and the US. So we were effective there. And we will try to be, we will obviously work hard to try to put our weight, and it's, in our case, it's the weight of argument, it's the weight of example, rather than the weight of raw power or raw votes. We don't have the votes, but we can combine with other countries to find, majorities within the council. So the council, the European Union, will be a more challenging place for Ireland after Brexit. We have an extraordinary position vis-a-vis the United States, in that it's two-pronged. First of all, there's a traditional connection, which goes back to the 19th century and the arrival here of vast numbers of Irish immigrants who became part of the fabric of America, but remarkably still identify with Ireland, even though they may be generations removed from our island. And then secondly, there's the more modern economic relationship with 750 US companies, including many from California, with investments in Ireland. We have close understanding. We have an understanding of the business culture of the United States. And those companies come to Ireland because they can attract a highly qualified workforce. We have a competitive and open, and transparent taxation system, which is competitive. We have a government that's very well tuned to the needs of multinational companies operating in Ireland. And we can draw a pool of labor from all over the European Union. If you go to Google in Dublin, for example, you'll meet people there from 60 different language groups all over the European Union. And they can come to Ireland freely to work in Ireland with no barriers whatsoever. And that is something that Britain will not be able to offer companies from now on. So I do expect that we will gain additional weight in terms of US investment in Ireland, which is already at an exceptionally high level. I mean, we got $500 billion in trade, $500 billion in investment from America into Ireland at the moment, which is a huge figure. It's double our GDP, so you can see how significant it is. And we also have about $120 billion of investment in the United States, which for a country of 5 million people is pretty extraordinary. So I think the relationship with the US will really continue to develop and prosper. And I do believe that more and more US companies will start to see Ireland as an ideal platform for them within the European Union, where they can avail of the positive taxation environment, where they can access highly qualified English-speaking staff. The government understands the American business culture and is trying to be helpful, and that we have access to the European single market and access to a labor market of 450 million people. So, and I also think that politically we will be stepping up to the mark more and more in trying to be a bridge builder between the United States and the European Union. It is a bit of a tragedy that the last couple of years have seen tariffs being imposed, first of all, on steel and aluminum exports from the EU to the US, then on countervailing tariffs imposed by the European Union against US exports into Europe, and then on account of the Boeing Airbus dispute, more tariffs were imposed last year, and now the EU has the entitlement to impose tariffs on the US following from the WTO's judgment in the Boeing case. So, we're now in a situation where tariffs have become a serious handicap to the free flow of goods across the Atlantic between Europe and the United States. And we must really get away from that. We must recognize that the European Union and the US, between them, the trade between them, makes up 35% of the global economy. And likewise, that about 50% of foreign investment in the United States comes from the European Union. And likewise, about 50% of the investment in the European Union comes from the United States. In our case, it's about 75% because the US is by far the biggest investor. So all of that's going to give us a profile in the transatlantic arena, which we couldn't ever hope to have as a country of 5 million people that didn't have those traditional and contemporary connections with the United States.
Great, thank you. Well, the clock is wound down. Ambassador Mulhall, Connell, do you have any last comments or thoughts you'd like to leave with our members and our partners on the call?
Maybe, Sean, just first of all, thank everyone for sticking with it. I think it's a very interesting conversation. And say this, to pick up on the ambassador's point, the Republic of Ireland is a common law system which is inherited from the United Kingdom, which makes it a very advantageous place to do business. It will also be the only English-speaking member state in the European Union, and therefore the obvious bridgehead for the rest of the English-speaking world back into the European Union. Northern Ireland, if things go the right way over the next few months, will be able to find itself appended in the right way on critical issues to the Republic of Ireland. And so to address one of the questions that we didn't get to, if Northern Ireland can remain with a relationship with the Customs Union, then it can remain the sort of place that people can come and invest into, even though technically it'll be outside the European Union. Why? Because it will effectively enjoy a special status. And I would say that because there's 8 million people on the island of Ireland, and 2 million of those are up on this side of the border, and they have every bit as much talent, every bit as much energy, every bit as much ambition to be part of a fantastic relationship with enterprise, and particularly American enterprise. And so that's why, again, back to this conversation point, the next 6 weeks are so darn important. And you know, we need Dan and the ambassador and the team in Dublin and the team in Brussels and people in London to see sense and make sure they get this one over the line for all our sakes.
Thanks, Connell.
Just a final, final word from me. I mean, there's it's a crucial. I mean, I said 6 weeks because things can always be stretched out, but it won't stretch out beyond that. So, I mean, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has said he wants everything done and dusted by the middle of October. That's ambitious. The European Parliament said the end of October, and you know, who knows, it might stretch into November, but I think that's about the end of it. If it doesn't work then, it's hard to see how a solution can be found. But a solution is achievable. And for example, the protocol on Northern Ireland, when it's implemented, and it will be because it's an international agreement, so the British government cannot walk away from it. When it's implemented, its aim is to give Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. Free access to the European single market and free access to the UK single market. It'll be the only place in the world that'll have that kind of access. So that should be seen as a great boost to Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, people talk about borders in the REC. It will not be a border. It will be a series of arrangements. And I mean, what's at stake at the moment about the Northern Ireland Protocol's implementation? There are two main things. One is state aid rules to prevent Northern Ireland companies from benefiting from British state aid arrangements, which would then give them an unfair advantage when they export into the European Union. That's a level playing field provision, which I think can be resolved. And then the second point is to agree on the goods at risk, so that when goods are crossing the REC, most of them are destined to be consumed in Northern Ireland. It's foodstuffs and consumer goods coming from Britain to Northern Ireland to be consumed in Northern Ireland, and therefore of no relevance to the European single market. But there will be certain goods that will be capable of being exported further, transshipped into the European Union via the open border in Ireland. And there has to be agreement on how to identify those goods and then what to do when you identify them to prevent the companies concerned from exporting their goods into Northern Ireland and into the European single market without abiding by the regulations of the single market and without paying the tariffs that may or may not arise. These are eminently solvable problems, but it does require that the two sides negotiate together in the way they negotiated at the end of last year, when they found a solution to a problem that seemed to be heading for failure. Because I'm a great believer in the European Union's capacity to reach a consensus, reach a compromise, even when everything looks bleak and impossible. I've seen it so many times. You go to meetings and you're told there's no way. The different countries are totally at odds with each other. And somehow, the secret sauce of negotiating prowess on the part of European diplomats produces the goods. And I'm hopeful that the goods will be produced again this time, because I do not think that this set of challenges we have now, both between the UK and the EU and with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol, it would be a horrendous failure of political and diplomatic will to fail to resolve questions that are eminently resolvable.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I think a hopeful note. Ambassador Mulhall and Connell, thank you very, very much for spending your time with us today across many different time zones. We greatly appreciate it. I want to thank our audience for joining us today, and remind you that very shortly there will be an email follow-up with you. The program has been recorded. That'll be available. Any resources we mentioned today, some survey questions will come with that. So look for that email soon. And would remind our listeners too, these are unusual times. The council has a Bay Area Council COVID-19 response page. We're here, our team is here to support you and work with you. So please contact us as necessary if you need that kind of support. And with that, I want to thank again our extraordinarily knowledgeable panelists and everybody in the audience for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be involved.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.